Hey friends, I'm Daniel Nesbitt, and welcome back to designing your first font in Glyphs Mini. In the last few episodes, actually, we've made quite a bit of progress through the lowercase. And at this point, I've kind of decided that since we're so close to the end of the lowercase characters, that we'll go ahead and we'll finish out what we've got here before we progress to the uppercase letters. So rather than chat too much, I think I just want to dive in and let's get started with somewhat of an easy one for today's episode. I'm going to go ahead with the lowercase j. And this one actually isn't going to be too terrible to put together here. We are going to steal a little bit of DNA from the lowercase I there. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and grab the lowercase t as well. And we're going to grab the little foot at the bottom there. And like so many things I've done before, a lot of this is just going to be a bit of reusing components so we can kind of put these things together. And it looks like we've got a pretty decent lowercase j starting off here. Now there are a couple things that I need to go through and address. The first one is we need to get it down to the the descender height. And then the second thing that I want to do, because this is curved, I actually want this to have a little bit of overshoot. And I don't know that I'm going to do a ton. I think I'm actually just going to bump it down a couple units there. But already you see that we're off to a really good start. Now the other thing that I'm going to do is go ahead, we're just going to pull in some side bearings here just to get started. I'm going to do something a little bit tricky with these side bearings in a moment. But one thing I want to address is usually the J doesn't come down and curve as much as it is here. I think in this case, in this typeface, I could make the argument to have it the same since we're kind of going after that modular look. But I think when you're getting started out and designing a typeface, I think it's kind of good to maybe get in the habit of knowing that some of these things change. And I think this one's one of those that we can do that with. So what I'm going to do is we're actually going to go and maybe just break off this a little bit. And I think what my goal here is I just want to have kind of maybe a tinier terminal here for the J. So what I'm going to do, we're going to kind of play around with this a little bit, but I don't think it needs to be too much. It doesn't need to be very drastic, but just something that kind of comes down, kind of curves around, gives a little bit of a hey, how you doing kind of thing. And then we'll call it good there. So again, we'll go through. There are some limitations, of course. I've mentioned this before that we do run into with this coarse grid here. But again, we're just kind of keeping things simple and we're not getting too technical or too crazy with some of the things that we're doing here. So I'm going to back out a little bit. And I mean, a lot of this is just going to be things like playing around with placement of your points. How are things looking? When you adjust this portion of a letter, it's interesting how it kind of can be a bit of a cascading effect towards the other places or other spots of the character. It's not always as simple as just changing one thing and everything else falls into line. There are many days I wish that were the case, but it seems like that's not always how it should be. All right, so we can go with something like that, but you kind of get the idea. It comes down and it just kind of has a smaller hook than what we had before. I'm just going to kind of play around a little bit with how some of these curve out so I get a nice smooth transition. Maybe I kind of bring that down a little bit. And really what I'm trying to do here, and I think the bulk of what type design is training your eye that as this comes down, is this a smooth curve? We don't want something that's very pointy where it feels like it, kind of creates a point and then juts out. On the flip side, we don't want it to feel too flat either. It's why I've mentioned before things like having your 2 points here kind of at a 45-degree angle. Oftentimes that gets you off to a pretty good start. And it makes it a little bit easier to manage some of those points. So what we'll do, maybe just kind of back that one off a little bit. But I think something like that isn't too terribly offensive. All right. So now that I've got all this set up, probably the next thing I'm going to take a look at here is going to be the spacing of this. And I'm going to go ahead and just take a lowercase n and put it to each side of this. So the thing with the lowercase j is that this hook actually factors into your spacing here. And that kind of makes this look goofy because when we read, we're kind of reading more in the space between the x height and the baseline. And if we do that, we notice that there's kind of a big old gap here that it really doesn't look that great. But according to my settings here, I have 70 units on each side of my J, which is, ideally what you would want, but visually it doesn't look right. So what I'm going to do is we're actually going to do a custom setting here. And this is where I might actually go into something like negative spacing. Because what happens here is if we now look at it with negative 30 units as my left side bearing, now we get that even space on either side of the J. And even if I do the O, you kind of see you get that it's even on the round characters as well. So ideally, that's typically what I do. Now, there are combinations like Q and J where sometimes that can look a little bit strange. And typically, if we get to the kerning stage, you often think about kerning as in bringing two things closer together. However, this is one of those instances where because you have combinations like the Q and J here, which really aren't very common in most languages as far as I know, if we do need to address this, we can actually do positive kerning where we're actually pushing the two letters apart if we find that this is crashing into things in an unpleasant way when we get to that stage. So it's a little bit of a trickery, but I'd say for 99% of the cases, we can actually get by with a negative side bearing there so that it looks correct, and then we can address things like this when we get to the kerning stage if we feel that that's necessary. So pretty easy, pretty basic. That gets us a lowercase j. Now for the remainder here, we've got the K, V, W, X, Y, and Z. And I would actually kind of prefer to work with these a little bit separately because these are all of our angled characters. We've got our square characters like the lowercase n, the rounds like the O, and then the angled ones where you've got angled pieces there. So we're actually going to jump over to probably what everybody's favorite character is, which is the S. And I'm going to pull in a couple letters here just to help us out a little bit. And when we get started with this, I want to reassure you that doing an S doesn't actually have to be that complicated. And I know that sounds really odd to say and counterintuitive, but I think a lot of people see it because it kind of has that snaky shape to it. And it's very intimidating because, let's be honest, there's a lot going on there. So there's a couple things to know about the S, and the first thing is that ideally we want, and I'll just kind of draw a shape over it here, but we want a shape that kind of resembles this, and that's, there we go. It's a little embellished here, but you get the idea. So the top portion of the S we want to kind of be a little bit narrower, the bottom is a little bit wider, and that kind of is what gives it its the feeling that it's the right way up. So the first thing we'll have to do is we'll have to consider how we're going to maybe shrink the top down a little bit and then widen out the bottom part of this. The second thing we might do before we get too far into drawing this, sometimes you can go back and you can look at other characters. Now I brought in the O and the C, which I think I'm probably going to mostly focus on those to get started with this. Sometimes, depending on your typeface, you may have some hints from other characters as well. If there's something like a sharp corner, sometimes maybe an E might have that where you can kind of, rip some DNA off of that. But based on what I'm seeing here, I really don't have much that's going to help me out. So I'm going to go back to my original screen here. And it looks like this is probably what we're going to have to work with. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and we're going to delete that section there. I'm going to pull this one out maybe 3 units, and I'm going to bring this top piece in about the same once I get it. And so this is kind of setting the stage for that shape that I was telling you about. As far as this curve goes here, I'm not really thrilled with it, but at the moment it's kind of acting as an anchor for me so that I can figure out where things are going. And basically what we're going to do is we're going to grab the pen tool, and I'm just going to go a little off to the side here at the top. I'm not going to worry too much right now about where these points specifically are going. I just kind of want them in the general area. And we're going to kind of create a zigzaggy lightning bolt kind of shape there. And then all I'm going to do is I'm going to take these 2 points, and I'm just going to make sure they're vertically aligned with these 2 here. That was kind of what I was using that piece to mark off. From there, we'll go ahead and we'll, actually, I'm going to bring this maybe back a little bit. Because we moved this over 3 units, I'm actually going to bring that side of it back in 3 units. And we'll do more adjusting on this later, but something like that. And then over here, I think for now I'm just going to leave that as it is. All right. I'm also going to go ahead and line these 2 points up, and I'm going to note that that's 70 units apart. If I take a look at that, that is 65 units apart. That is 90. That is too many. That is 80. 75. There we go. 70. All right, perfect. So we'll probably do something maybe about like that. And I'm just taking a look at how this is, falling in line with the end of the S down here. Again, trying to keep that that shape to it that we talked about a little bit earlier. So now that we've kind of got this lightning bolt pattern going on, the next thing that I'm going to do is hold down my Option key, and we're going to start bringing in some handles so we can convert this to curves. At this point, it gets really easy because I'm just going to go ahead and I'm going to drag all of these curves out so that everything is even in a 90-degree fashion. So grab all of these. Now, one thing you can do is you can highlight this piece here, and if you hit the return key on your keyboard, it actually gets you a corner here, a corner unit. So you can actually go ahead and move both handles together. Keeps them, as one piece rather than 2 separate pieces. I find in Glyphs Mini this is a little bit weird though, because when I enable that corner, when I change that corner type, it doesn't always snap. If you get into a program like Glyphs, the full version of Glyphs, when I hit the enter button, it actually lines things up the way I'm doing it manually here. Not sure why that happens in Glyphs Mini, but typically what we'll do here is we'll just go through and we'll get these all lined up manually, and then I just go ahead and convert them to that green shape so that we've got the curve instead of a corner there. So with that out of the way, we now have something that kind of resembles a funky looking S, and at this point it's going to be a lot of just dragging things around until it looks right. And I know that's a little bit maybe scientific if you want to kind of joke about it that way, but ideally what we're looking for is we're trying to figure out ways to smooth out shapes. Now the thing is that I'm mostly focused on this portion here and this portion here to start. The spine of the S, I can kind of dial that in a little bit as we go here, but my first concern is how does this look as it kind of spirals around or curves around? Are we getting something that looks relatively smooth? And sometimes it takes a little bit of playing around and adjusting shapes a little bit, but that's the whole goal here. Like, all we're trying to do is just make this look smooth, make this look like it's a nice, pleasing curve. And I can understand if you're sitting there shouting, that's easier than it sounds. But really, it's just, I think the big thing with an S is just taking things one step at a time, not getting ahead of yourself, not overthinking things too much, but just something, that we get that nice curve, that nice shape. If you have something like a C, in my case here, that's off to the side, maybe you can kind of reference that a little bit. you know, later on we might even go through and add the C as a component. You know, you could do something like that where you bring it in here and maybe some of these shapes, once I grab the right one, we can kind of go in and adjust these a little bit, maybe to fall in line more with the shape of the C. For something like the bottom here, I can just for something like the bottom here, we can just go through, we can select the C, and if we just reverse it, you know, first verse same as the second, so to speak, we can kind of go through and adjust these a little bit. Sometimes it's not always going to be exact or one-to-one. You may determine that something needs to change or a shape needs to, you know, be a little bit different. That's okay. In this case, it kind of looks a little wonky still. I may even bring that back so this looks more like a 90-degree angle here and here. I may even decide that needs to kick out a little bit more. But really that's what a lot of this is, trial and error. And another tip that I have too is sometimes you might have to mimic one shape at the top and the bottom here. So like in this case, I've kind of, you know, made this seam at an angle, and it might be worth reflecting that at the top here so that we get a little bit of an even shape to things. Again, it's a little bit of trial and error. Sometimes it works, sometimes not so much. But we start to get something that looks pretty decent there, I think. Now for the fun part, the spine. And really this is going to be about pulling these four handles here. So we don't need to sit and perfect this all in one go, but ultimately what I find is if you take the two outer handles here and you start to kind of pull them out a little bit more, you start to kind of get a shape there a little bit. And again, it's just going to be, as this curve starts to come around, is it even, is it smooth? You know, maybe you have to kind of bump things out a little bit. Something that I've noticed with the S is sometimes these 2 points here kind of take on a little bit of an angle. They're not usually straight across from each other. But the important part is that you're kind of holding that shape, that line together. You know, maybe things that you did in an earlier step have to come back and change a little bit more. Don't be afraid to zoom in a little bit if you need to. But it's just a matter of kind of holding that shape. That's all we're trying to do here, and balance that out a little bit. And then just kind of figure out as this curves around, you know, now we start to think about the angle of this spine. You know, it might be responding really well down here, so maybe we go with more of a flatter spine. We can kind of explore that a little bit. Again, kind of adjust some of these shapes. I'm just worried about the outside one for now. But you start to see how it comes together a little bit. It's just a little bit at a time, and a little bit goes a long way here. And again, it's all about moving these points so that you start to kind of get a nice shape here. And the thing is, because we're doing this on a grid, things kind of snap together in a way. You can kind of use that to your advantage a little bit. The other thing that we're taking a look at too is the negative space here and here. And again, like other things, you usually want a little bit less space or lighter space at the top versus the bottom. You want something a little bit heavier. That's what gives it its direction and its shape, and what can make an S feel like it's the right way up or the wrong way. But again, that's kind of what we're focused on. So, you know, if you're not feeling it, if you want to kind of, you know, adjust the spine a little bit so that you can kind of push the spine either down or up, depending on which side needs a little bit more or a little bit less. You can go through and do things like that. But again, it's one of those things. Take your time a little bit. Make sure that things are looking right. One other thing you can do if you're not really getting a result that you want is you can take an ellipse here, draw it out, and see. I only need one, but draw it out and see, what's that looking like? Is it an even shape? If I drag it down a little bit further here, it may not line up perfectly, but it looks pretty close. Again, my grid's going to kind of wreak havoc with these lines a little bit, but you kind of get the idea. It can really help you out as far as the weight of your spine there. You may bring in other characters or other round characters as well. Figure out, does this look right? If I were to have this up in a line of letters, does the weight look right? Does it look even? Does it look like it belongs, basically? For fun, maybe I decide that I'm gonna kind of, make this a little bit more of an S-y shape. We can kind of do things like that a little bit and just kind of push things around a little bit. But after a while, you start to kind of get a shape that you like. It looks pretty even too. And I would say for something like your first character like this, that I don't think is too bad. So what I might do here at this point is just go ahead and adjust my side bearings. I'm actually going to push the S in a little bit closer together than the O, which looks like 58 and 57, so I'm doing 50 on each side. And the reason that I'm doing that is because unlike an O where we've got the shape, it's kind of enclosed there, and you've got that line or that weight that's right to the edge of the side bearings of your letter, the S has these openings here. And because of those openings, I think it does need to be a little bit closer. I might even do something like that. And you can even go back and put the S between a couple of O's and a couple of N's there to see, is this look pretty even? And as you add more letters around it, you can start to determine if the color of the S looks right. Does it look too thin? Does it look too thick? Those are things that you can kind of go back and forth and try and sort out. But typically what you want is the two ends here should be kind of the thinnest points of the S. And then as you kind of curve around, it starts to gain more weight as we go through the spine of the S. All right. So there's one last trick you can do with an S, and I may not do it here, but I think this is worth pointing out. Once you have your spine of your S this way, you may notice that it kind of can be kind of flowy or kind of curvy, and sometimes you don't want that. I don't recommend doing this until you get to the very, very end or close to the end of drawing your S, but if you go back, there are a couple more points that you can add here, typically around the halfway point of the S. And sometimes you might want to do this if you want a little bit finer control over the spine of your S, if you want it to be a little bit flatter, if you want to adjust, kind of the direction here a little bit. Maybe you do want it a little bit straighter. Truthfully, it's up to you. I'm just going to go ahead and undo it because I don't really know that it's adding anything in my case, but it's just something that I want to point out. That is something that you can add. But again, I really don't recommend doing that until you're really, really close and really, really happy with the S. Think of that more as a tweak than anything else that you can do. But with all that said, we've got a pretty decent lowercase s there. This is one of those things where you really could go back and tweak to your heart's content, but the few points that we have there, I think, make it pretty easy to go back and adjust things to your liking. And really, with a little bit of time, a little bit of patience, an S doesn't have to be that intimidating. So the last character that I'm going to go ahead, probably for this episode, and take care of is the lowercase v, because we're going to want to start thinking about our angled characters here. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull in a couple letters to the side here, the O and the N. Just use my control characters. I think that'll be a good starting point. Now the trick with angled characters like a V is when your eye looks at an angled line, it tends to visually remove weight, if you will. And so there's going to be a little bit of a trickery going on here, because we can go through and we can angle this out a little bit, but it might look weird to your eye. It's more than just two angled lines that are intersecting each other at the bottom. The other thing that we need to keep in mind is that when you get down to this join down here, that you get a little bit of a dark area. This is similar to what we were talking about with the curve of the N going into the vertical stroke here. So we've got a few things that we need to kind of deal with when we design a lowercase v. And what we do here will translate to things like the X, the W, the Y, and actually the K as well. But kind of what we're after here is we do want to figure out a width that looks pleasant. In my case, I've got, it looks like about 8 units across the top here, if I'm counting my squares right, which I think I am. But because it tapers down, I think that's actually okay. 8 is also an even number, so it actually lines up pretty well. I guess I could kind of do 7. But I think that, I don't know, that might get a little too narrow. We're going to start with 8 units of space across the top there, and if I change my mind, we'll adjust as we go. So with that out of the way, what we're going to do is I'm actually going to grab these 2 points here, and I'm moving the 2 inner lines, these 2 inner lines in a little bit. So what we tend to do when we draw an angled character, among the many things we do, is from the top here to the bottom, it is actually going to kind of taper into a narrower line. And if I copy and paste this, you'll see that if I overlay the 2 points there, that it actually tapers down a good amount. And the reason for that is when it gets to the join here, it actually looks even to your eye, and you almost don't even notice that it tapers down a little bit. And then the second thing that we're going to do, like I had mentioned earlier, because this is an angled line, it actually looks a little bit narrower than the straight line of the end there. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to hold down the space key so I can see this filled in as a preview. And then I'm just going to nudge it out maybe a unit or 2 on that side. And then on this side, I'm probably only going to go out 1 unit. And the idea here is that when it's angled like this, that it has the same visual weight as the O and the N do. And I could adjust this a little bit. Maybe I decide that's too much, so everybody goes back in 1. This is also a good moment to make use of that preview panel along the bottom of your screen. Go through and add some side bearings as well, so it kind of looks spaced out a little bit better. This is definitely one of those things where it does maybe take a little bit of trial and error. Maybe I add a little bit more to the top rather than adding things to the outside, kind of add it on the inside. You can kind of play around. Sometimes too you run into an issue because we're on a grid that it may be difficult to get kind of that Goldilocks weight that we're after. I don't think this looks too terrible. Maybe I even go a little bit further in on the spacing there. Again, we'll go and we'll just place the V between an N and an O there. I don't think something like that looks too terrible. So again, just to kind of recap on this, because there was a few things that I did. It's a little bit wider of a line at the top. It tapers as we get down to the bottom, and then all we did was add a little bit of weight to either side, just to give it a visual similar weight to the rest of our lines used throughout our typeface. And then the last thing I did there was I'm using some really tight side bearings. Again, this is just because we've got a lot of inner, or I guess outer negative space there. So that just kind of helps make things look pretty even when we have it stacked up next to an N or an O, which would be two common, I guess, places or spots that you would see a lowercase v in. So if we back out a little bit, that I'd say was a pretty good run there. Just being able to reuse a letter like an I and a T to recreate a lowercase j. And then in our case, just using a letter C and a little bit of patience to construct what our S looks like. Now that we've got the V out of the way, we can kind of use this as our control character for the remaining letters that we have in this typeface. Obviously, the W and the Y will probably be some pretty easy ones that we can make some progress with that. The K, X, and Z will take a little bit more work, but now that we've kind of established how these angled characters are going to look, or at least borrow some DNA from, we shouldn't have any problem going through those final 5 characters and finishing out our alphabet. So with that, if you've enjoyed this episode, make sure to go ahead and hit that like button. If you haven't already, also make sure you hit that subscribe button as well, so you know when the next episode of our first font series in Glyphs Mini comes out. And as always, the comment section is open. If you have any tips, tricks, ideas, things that I've missed, or just insights that you might have, maybe it makes people's lives a little bit easier than Glyphs Mini. I'm always excited to hear what folks have to say. So with that, thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next episode.